The command was clear. "Rex, attack!" Officers tensed as the powerful German Shepherd lunged forward. But just as he was about to strike, something unthinkable happened. The dog froze mid-air, whined, and instead of attacking, ran straight into the old man's arms. Silence fell across the park. The old man, dressed in a faded military jacket, wrapped his trembling hands around the dog's neck. Tears streamed down his face. The officers shouted, confused. No one could explain what had just happened. But when the old man whispered a single word, "Buddy," everything changed. What no one realized in that moment was that this wasn't disobedience. It was recognition, and the truth behind it would bring an entire city to tears. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The park was unusually quiet that morning. Sunlight filtered through the tall oak trees, scattering golden patches across the grass where children usually played. Today, however, a crowd had gathered, murmuring, uneasy, their eyes fixed on one spot near the old fountain. 3 uniformed police officers stood tense, their hands near their belts, while a German Shepherd, muscular, alert, eyes sharp as glass, waited beside them. His name was Rex, the department's most trusted canine. "Target in sight," one officer muttered into his radio. At the far end of the park sat an elderly man on a bench dressed in an old military jacket. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there staring at the ground, a small paper bag beside him. But something about him had triggered a report from a passerby. Claims of suspicious behavior, maybe a weapon. The team didn't want to take chances. Rex's handler, Officer Mark Dawson, gave the signal for standby. "Stay alert," he whispered, eyes locked on the old man. The German Shepherd's ears flicked, muscles tensing. Rex was trained to respond only when ordered. Years of discipline, countless drills, he never hesitated. But today something in his eyes seemed uncertain. The commanding officer raised his hand. "Let's move." The team began to approach slowly, boots crunching on gravel. The old man didn't notice at first. His head was bowed, hands trembling slightly as he reached into his coat pocket. That tiny motion was enough to make one officer shout, "He's reaching for something! Rex, attack!" Mark commanded. The world seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. Then the powerful K9 launched forward, sprinting with fierce precision. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The old man looked up just in time to see the blur of tan and black fur racing toward him. His eyes widened, not in fear but in disbelief. But just when everyone braced for impact, Rex stopped. He skidded to a halt mere inches away, his claws scraping the pavement. The growl in his throat faded into a soft whimper. The dog tilted his head, sniffed the air, and suddenly his entire body language changed. The aggression melted away, replaced by confusion, and then something deeper, almost human. He whimpered again and stepped closer, tail low, eyes locked on the old man's face. "Rex, what are you doing?" Mark shouted, stunned. The K9 didn't respond. Instead, Rex took another hesitant step forward. Then another. The old man slowly lifted his hand, voice trembling. "Buddy?" he whispered. The sound of that name, one simple word, seemed to strike something deep inside the dog. Rex froze, ears perking, eyes wide with recognition. His body began to tremble. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he lunged, not to attack but to embrace. Gasps filled the park. Officers froze, unsure of what they were witnessing. The dog pressed his head against the old man's chest, whining softly. The old man's hands shook as he reached out, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. Tears streamed down his weathered face. Mark stood speechless. In all his years of handling Rex, he had never seen him defy a direct command, never. And yet, in that moment, every instinct told him this wasn't disobedience. It was recognition. Something from the past had just come alive. The crowd fell silent, the tension broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the old man's sobs. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The park had fallen into a stunned silence. The 3 officers stood frozen in disbelief, their hands still hovering near their holsters. Rex, the K9 trained to attack on command, now sat beside the old man, his massive head resting gently on the man's trembling lap. It was as if the dog had forgotten every ounce of training, every rule drilled into him. His tail moved slowly, uncertainly, brushing against the gravel like a nervous heartbeat. Officer Mark Dawson felt his pulse hammering. He had trained Rex for years. He knew the dog's instincts better than anyone. But this was different. "Rex, heel," he barked, trying to restore control. The dog didn't move. Instead, he let out a soft, sorrowful whine and looked up at Mark with pleading eyes as if begging him not to interfere. The old man's wrinkled hands trembled as he stroked the dog's fur. "It's you, isn't it?" he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Buddy, after all these years." His eyes glistened, each tear carving a trail down his weathered cheeks. The man's words barely reached the officers, but the way Rex responded made everything clear. The dog's ears perked at the sound of that name, Buddy, and his tail began to wag faster, his entire body trembling with excitement. "What the hell is going on?" one of the younger officers muttered, lowering his weapon. "Is this some kind of joke?" Mark shook his head, still unable to process what he was seeing. "No, he's never acted like this, ever." He took a cautious step forward, his voice softening. "Sir, do you know this dog?" The old man looked up, his eyes full of pain and disbelief. "Know him?" he said, his voice trembling. "He saved my life." Those words hit like thunder. The crowd that had gathered nearby leaned in, whispering, some pulling out their phones to record. Rex looked from the old man to Mark, sensing the confusion in the air. His breathing quickened, ears twitching, as if he was torn between two worlds, the one that trained him to obey, and the one that taught him to love. The old man's hand slid along Rex's neck, fingers brushing against the collar. "They renamed you," he murmured, "but I'd know these eyes anywhere." He leaned closer, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "You're my boy. You're my buddy." Mark swallowed hard. Something in the old man's tone, pure, aching, and real, made his chest tighten. He'd seen countless interactions between people and canines, but never anything like this. Rex wasn't just recognizing a scent. This was emotional. This was personal. The other officers shifted uneasily. "Sir, we got a report about suspicious activity," one of them said carefully. "We thought you might be armed." The old man chuckled weakly through his tears. "The only thing I'm armed with," he whispered, "is memory." He looked back at the dog. "And I never thought I'd see mine again." Rex pressed closer, resting his paw on the man's leg, refusing to move. It was a silent declaration of loyalty, stronger than any command. Mark slowly lowered his hand from his belt, his voice barely audible. "Stand down," he said to the others. "There's something more here." The tension dissolved. Around them, the crowd's murmurs softened into awe. Rex and the old man stayed locked in that embrace, two souls reunited after years apart. And for the first time, even the officers understood. This wasn't defiance. This was destiny. The old man's eyes filled with tears as his trembling hands clutched the fur of the German shepherd pressed against him. His voice broke as he whispered, "Buddy, my boy, I thought I'd lost you forever." Around them, the park had gone completely silent. The officers who moments earlier had been ready for confrontation now stood frozen, their confusion turning into awe. Even the murmuring crowd kept their distance, sensing they were witnessing something sacred, something beyond training or orders. Mark's throat tightened as he watched the old man sob quietly into Rex's neck. The K9's steady breathing, once sharp and alert, had softened into something almost human, gentle, protective, full of understanding. His head rested against the man's shoulder, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had paused just to let this reunion happen. The old man's hand shook as he traced the outline of the badge on Rex's collar, his fingers brushing against the polished metal tag that read K9 Unit. Rex. He let out a weak chuckle through his tears. "Rex, huh? That's what they call you now?" His voice trembled with emotion. "You used to be Buddy. You used to come running every time I called your name." Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, how do you know him?" The old man looked up, eyes glassy but full of certainty. "Because," he whispered, "I trained him. I was his handler. Years ago." Gasps rippled through the officers. Mark blinked, disbelief flashing across his face. "You were his original handler?" The old man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the dog. "We served together overseas. He was more than a partner, he was my family." His lips trembled as he spoke, his hand gripping Rex's fur tighter. "They told me he didn't make it after the ambush, but I never believed them." Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound of the old man's voice. His tail moved again, slow and steady. The look in his eyes, soft, emotional, loyal, was unmistakable. This wasn't coincidence. This was recognition. Mark took a cautious step back, feeling something shift inside him. The air felt heavy with meaning. The other officers lowered their hands from their belts, their hardened expressions softening into quiet respect. The old man leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Rex's. "You remembered me," he whispered, his voice breaking again. "After everything, you still remembered." Rex let out a soft, low whine, the kind that only came from deep within a dog's soul. It was a sound of recognition, of love, of time folding in on itself. For the first time in years, the old man smiled through his tears. "Good boy," he whispered. "My brave, loyal boy." The bond that war had forged, and time had broken, was whole again. The old man's voice trembled as he spoke, and suddenly the park seemed to fade away. His mind drifted back, years earlier, to the unforgiving deserts of Afghanistan. The roar of helicopters filled the air, the ground shook under the weight of armored vehicles, and the sun blazed mercilessly overhead. Amid the dust and chaos, Sergeant Henry Miller knelt beside his K-9 partner, a young German shepherd named Buddy. The dog's eyes were sharp, his ears twitching, every muscle ready. "Easy, boy," Miller murmured, giving Buddy a reassuring pat. "You know the drill." The two had been inseparable since training. Months of trust building, obstacle courses, and life-or-death drills. Buddy wasn't just a K-9. He was family. Together, they'd saved soldiers from hidden IEDs, tracked enemy fighters, and brought home men who would have otherwise never seen another sunrise. That morning, the unit was assigned to clear a small village rumored to be laced with explosives. Miller adjusted his helmet, scanning the dusty horizon. "Stay close," he whispered, his hand resting lightly on Buddy's harness. The dog sniffed the ground, moving carefully, tail stiff, every motion precise. The air was heavy, too quiet. Then Buddy stopped, ears perked, body frozen. Miller's gut tightened. "Get back!" he shouted. The explosion came a second later. The ground erupted, throwing sand, debris, and shrapnel into the sky. Miller hit the dirt hard, ears ringing, lungs burning. He couldn't see. Just smoke and chaos. Through the haze, he heard the sound of frantic barking. "Buddy!" he screamed. The dog's silhouette appeared through the smoke, limping but alive, dragging himself toward Miller. Even injured, Buddy pushed through, reaching his handler's side, whining desperately as if pleading for him to move. Miller felt warmth trickling down his arm. Blood. He tried to stand, but his leg gave out. "Go!" he shouted hoarsely, pushing the dog away. "Save yourself!" But Buddy refused. He stayed beside him, guarding, growling at every sound. When enemy fire broke out, the loyal dog leapt forward, shielding Miller from the blast. The rescue team arrived minutes later, pulling survivors from the wreckage. In the confusion, Miller was unconscious when they found him. The medics believed he was gone, another casualty of war. Buddy, too weak to move, was carried away by soldiers who thought his handler had perished. When Miller awoke days later in a field hospital, Buddy was gone. The Army told him the K-9 unit had been reassigned, his partner given a new handler. "He'll keep serving," they said. But for Miller, something inside him broke that day. He returned home a different man, his body healed, but his heart never did. Now, years later, that same dog, older, stronger, renamed Rex, was sitting before him again. And as Miller looked into those familiar amber eyes, the years of pain, loss, and longing melted away. Time hadn't erased their bond. It had only tested it. In that park, surrounded by stunned officers and strangers, the war hero finally reunited with his lost partner. The desert wind howled across the barren landscape as Sergeant Henry Miller crouched behind a crumbling wall, his heart pounding beneath his vest. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the shattered village ahead. His radio crackled with static. "Alpha Team, move in," came the order. Miller looked down at Buddy, his loyal German shepherd who waited for the signal. "You ready, boy?" he whispered, scratching behind his ear. Buddy gave a quiet bark and leaned forward, muscles coiled, eyes burning with focus. This was supposed to be a simple sweep. Clear a deserted compound suspected of storing enemy munitions, but nothing in war ever went according to plan. The team moved carefully, boots crunching over debris, rifles raised. Buddy led the way, sniffing for explosives, every step deliberate. Miller trusted him more than any man in the unit. When Buddy stopped tail stiff, Miller froze. The dog's low growl vibrated through the silence. "Hold up," Miller warned. He signaled for his men to halt. But before anyone could react, the world exploded. A deafening blast tore through the compound. The shockwave knocked Miller backward, dust and fire filling the air. His ears rang as he hit the ground hard, his vision fading to a blur of smoke and chaos. He couldn't see his men. He couldn't hear their screams. All he could make out was the echo of Buddy's frantic barking somewhere in the distance. "Miller, fall back!" Someone shouted over the radio, but the transmission cut out. Miller coughed, his throat burning. "Buddy!" he yelled, trying to stand. Through the haze, he spotted his K9 partner sprinting toward a wounded soldier pinned under debris. Buddy tugged at the man's vest, refusing to leave him. "Good boy," Miller shouted, pushing himself forward. But the relief was short-lived. Another explosion ripped through the ground, closer this time. Miller felt the searing pain in his leg before everything went black. When he opened his eyes again, the battlefield was silent. The once bustling village was reduced to rubble. Smoke curled into the evening sky. Buddy was nowhere in sight. "Buddy?" Miller croaked, dragging himself forward, every inch agony. Blood stained the sand beneath him. He could hear distant gunfire, but his focus was only on one thing: his dog. "Come on, boy. Answer me." But there was nothing. Only the whistle of the wind and the faint crackle of flames. The rescue chopper arrived minutes later, but it felt like a lifetime. As medics lifted Miller into the aircraft, he fought against them, screaming Buddy's name. "We'll find him," one medic shouted over the noise. "We'll bring him home." But deep down, Miller knew. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was Buddy's silhouette running toward the smoke, his tail low, his bark fading into the distance. In the reports that followed, Buddy was listed as missing in action. The military assumed he'd been lost in the second blast. Miller refused to believe it. Somewhere deep inside, he felt it. His dog was still alive. And that belief, fragile as it was, would carry him through every lonely year that followed. When Henry Miller awoke, the world was no longer a battlefield. It was a blur of white walls, antiseptic air, and the steady beeping of hospital monitors. His body ached, his leg wrapped in thick bandages, his throat dry as sand. For a brief moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the memories came crashing back, the explosion, the fire, and Buddy's desperate bark echoing through the smoke. His hand twitched toward the empty space beside his bed, where his partner should have been. But there was only silence. A nurse noticed him stirring and called the medic. Within moments, a group of officers entered, faces solemn, uniforms dusty from the desert. Miller's heart sank before they spoke. "Sergeant Miller," one said quietly, "you're lucky to be alive. You saved 2 men out there." Miller blinked, his voice hoarse. "What about Buddy?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "The dog didn't make it," the medic finally said. The second explosion hit the southern wall. No one could get near it. Miller's chest tightened. He turned his face away, blinking hard, but the tears came anyway. He'd seen soldiers die before, but this loss was different. Buddy wasn't just a K9. He was a brother in arms, a heartbeat that had stood beside him when bullets rained down and the world fell apart. Losing him felt like losing a piece of himself. Days turned into weeks as Miller recovered, each sunrise a cruel reminder of the one name that haunted his dreams. The military honored him for his bravery, awarding him a medal he could barely look at. "He did most of the saving," Miller whispered one day to a chaplain who came to pray for him. The chaplain smiled sadly. "Maybe God needed your partner elsewhere," he said softly. When Miller was finally discharged, he returned home a different man, The laughter of children, the hum of city life, none of it reached him. He'd find himself waking in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced he could hear Buddy's bark echoing through the dark. Each time, the silence afterward was unbearable. Unbeknownst to him, halfway across the world, Buddy had survived, rescued from the ruins by another unit, wounded, but alive. Unable to trace his original handler, the Army reassigned him to a police K-9 training facility under a new name, Rex. The faithful dog served again, loyal as ever, though something in his eyes had changed. Both man and dog carried invisible scars, living parallel lives of loss and longing, two souls separated by war, bound by memory. Neither knew it then, but fate had already begun weaving their paths back together. Months turned into years, and the once battle-hardened K-9 Buddy had a new name, Rex, and a new life. The police academy's training fields were far different from the battle zones he once roamed, but the dog's discipline and intelligence made him stand out instantly. Officers admired him for his speed, obedience, and instinct. Yet despite his perfect performance, something about him was different. There were moments, brief, unexplainable pauses when he seemed lost in memories no one else could see. Officer Mark Dawson, his new handler, noticed it first. During drills, Rex would sometimes stop mid-command, his gaze fixed on the horizon, ears twitching as though hearing a voice from another world. Mark would call, "Rex, heel," but the dog wouldn't move. His amber eyes carried a kind of sorrow, haunting, searching. And then, just as suddenly, he'd snap back into focus and execute the order flawlessly. Strange one, isn't he? A fellow officer joked one afternoon as they packed up after training. It's like he's got ghosts in his head. Mark smiled faintly but said nothing. Deep down, he felt it too. Rex wasn't just any K-9. He carried a depth and emotion that went beyond training. When other dogs barked or played, Rex would sit quietly by himself, staring into the distance, his expression unreadable. One evening after a long day of patrol, Mark took Rex for a walk near the station. The city lights shimmered across the pavement, the air cool and calm. A street musician nearby began playing a soft tune on a harmonica, low, melancholic, military in rhythm. The moment the sound reached Rex's ears, his body stiffened. He froze, tail lowering, eyes locked in silent recognition. Mark frowned. "What is it, boy?" But Rex didn't respond. Instead, he let out a soft whimper and sat down, staring into the night. It was as if the melody had reached deep inside him, unlocking something he couldn't express. Mark knelt beside him, running a gentle hand over his fur. "You okay, partner?" he asked quietly. Rex turned his head, pressing it softly against Mark's chest, an unusual gesture for such a disciplined dog. For a brief second, Mark felt something strange himself, a bond he couldn't explain, like this dog carried an untold story waiting to surface. He didn't know it yet. But Rex's strange behavior wasn't random. It was memory. Somewhere deep inside, the loyal dog still remembered the desert, the voice that once called him Buddy, and the man he had never stopped waiting for. It was an ordinary afternoon patrol, or at least that's how it began. Officer Mark Dawson drove slowly through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine blending with the faint rustle of leaves. Beside him, Rex sat upright, his head slightly tilted as he watched the world pass by. They'd done this 100 times before, routine checks, peaceful days. But today, something about Rex felt off. His tail twitched restlessly, his ears pricked at every sound. When they reached the city park, Mark noticed the dog's sudden shift. Rex's posture changed, his breathing quickened, and a low whine escaped his throat. "What is it, boy?" Mark asked, scanning the area. Families picnicked on the grass. Children played near the fountain and old men sat feeding pigeons. But Rex's focus was locked in one direction. His gaze followed a frail figure sitting alone on a weathered bench beneath a tree. It was an elderly man, dressed in a faded military jacket, his posture straight, but his eyes distant. He sat quietly, clutching a small paper bag. Rex's muscles tensed, a soft growl rumbling deep in his chest. Not aggressive, but conflicted, as if fighting between instinct and emotion. Mark frowned. "You see something suspicious?" he murmured. Rex let out a short bark, his eyes fixed on the man. Without waiting for another command, he started to move. "Rex, stay," Mark shouted, but the dog didn't listen. He pulled against the leash, dragging his handler a few steps forward before breaking free completely. The sudden commotion turned heads. People stopped what they were doing as the K9 bolted across the park, his paws pounding the grass. The old man looked up, startled, as the massive German Shepherd charged toward him. Officers nearby reacted instantly. "Is he attacking?" Someone shouted. Mark's heart pounded. No, Rex, heel!" But the dog didn't slow down. The crowd gasped as the distance closed. 10 feet, 5 feet, then something incredible happened. Rex stopped. He didn't lunge. He didn't bark. Instead, he whimpered softly, lowering his head as he crept closer, his tail low and trembling. The old man's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the dog's face, his own eyes widening with disbelief. "Buddy?" he whispered. The sound of that name froze Rex in place. His ears perked, and for a long heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then the dog let out a broken whine, the kind that comes from recognition buried deep within the soul, and took one hesitant step forward. Mark watched, breathless as his disciplined K9 disobeyed every rule and moved toward a past no one else could see. The park erupted in chaos. Officers sprinted toward the scene, hands on their weapons, shouting commands as Rex stood frozen a few feet from the old man. To bystanders, it looked like a dangerous standoff, a trained K9 about to strike. The crowd's nervous chatter grew louder, phones lifted to record, tension rippling through the air. "Rex, stand down," Mark shouted, running full speed toward his dog. But Rex didn't move. He just stood there, ears back, tail low, eyes locked on the trembling man before him. Mark's radio crackled with urgency. "Dawson, what's going on?" "Restrain your K9 immediately." The old man looked terrified now. "Please," he whispered, raising a shaky hand. "Don't hurt him." His voice was frail, full of confusion, but the officers didn't hesitate. Two of them spread out, forming a perimeter around the bench. One officer, young and nervous, gripped his baton tightly. "He's gonna attack, sir," he shouted. Mark knew how this looked. Protocol demanded control, no hesitation. But deep down, something about Rex's behavior didn't feel threatening. There was a softness in his stance, a desperate hesitation that defied everything he'd been trained for. Still, orders were orders. Mark clenched his jaw and shouted, "Rex, attack!" The word sliced through the air like a blade. The crowd gasped. Rex lunged forward, muscles coiling, speed explosive. But what happened next silenced everyone. Instead of going for the old man's arm or shoulder like he'd been trained, Rex skidded to a halt inches away. His claws scraped the pavement, breath heaving. He looked up into the old man's eyes and whimpered. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The dog's chest rose and fell rapidly. Then, with a trembling motion, Rex lowered his head and pressed it against the man's knees. The old man's hands shook violently as he reached out, touching the familiar fur with disbelief. "Buddy," he whispered, voice cracking. "It's really you." The crowd murmured, confusion turning to awe. One officer muttered, "What the—" He's comforting him. Another lowered his weapon, eyes wide. Mark froze, realization dawning slowly. He'd never seen Rex refuse an order, not once in 5 years. Yet here he was, defying everything for reasons no one could explain. "Rex," Mark called softly now, stepping closer. "What are you doing, boy?" Rex turned his head slightly, his amber eyes glistening with something human. Recognition, love, pain. He gave a soft bark as if trying to tell his handler, "He's not a threat. He's mine." The old man let out a strangled sob, his wrinkled fingers burying into the dog's fur. "You found me," he whispered. "After all these years, you found me." Mark's radio buzzed again, but he didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat tightened as he realized what he was witnessing wasn't disobedience, it was reunion. And in that still, trembling moment surrounded by silence and disbelief, the truth began to surface. The old man wasn't a stranger at all. He was Rex's past, alive, breathing, and standing right in front of him. The air around the park grew still, as if even the wind refused to interrupt what was unfolding. Rex pressed himself closer to the old man, whining softly, his tail brushing the ground in hesitant circles. The officers stood in stunned silence, their radios crackling with unanswered calls. The crowd that had gathered moments ago out of fear now watched in quiet disbelief, some with hands over their mouths, others with tears glinting in their eyes. Mark Dawson took a slow step forward. His heart was pounding, not from adrenaline, but from something deeper, something he couldn't yet explain. "Sir," he said carefully, his voice low, Do you know this dog?" The old man looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands trembling as they cradled Rex's face. "Know him?" he whispered. "Son, this dog saved my life more times than I can count." His thumb brushed over Rex's scarred ear, and for the first time Rex closed his eyes. Not in obedience, but in peace. Mark felt a lump in his throat. "You mean he's my partner?" the old man interrupted softly. "From the war. They called him Buddy back then." His voice quivered as memories flooded back. "They told me he didn't make it. I buried his tag in the desert sand myself." Rex lifted his head at the sound of that name, Buddy. His tail began to wag, faster now, his entire body trembling with recognition. He nudged the old man's chest with his nose, sniffing frantically, as if trying to piece together what time had taken away. Then he let out a sound no one expected, a cry. Not a bark, not a growl. A deep, sorrowful cry that echoed across the park. The old man wrapped his arms around him, pulling the dog close. "It's okay, boy," he murmured through tears. "You don't have to look anymore. You found me." Mark felt his vision blur. He glanced at his fellow officers. None spoke. One young recruit quietly removed his cap, lowering his head out of respect. The old man's voice shook. "After the explosion, I thought I'd lost him. They said no dog could have survived that blast, but I never stopped believing. Every night I prayed he was alive somewhere." He smiled weakly through tears. "And here he is." Rex whined again, pressing his paw into the man's lap, refusing to move. Mark stepped closer, crouching beside them. "He's been with me for 5 years," he said softly. "We renamed him Rex. I never knew he had a past like this." The old man nodded slowly, stroking the dog's fur. "A name doesn't change who he is. Loyalty like his. That never fades." Rex turned his head between the two men, eyes full of warmth and understanding. It was as if he was telling them both that fate had finally done what duty could not. It had brought them home. And in that park, under the fading afternoon sun, a soldier and his lost partner were whole again. The officers gathered around quietly, their earlier tension replaced by awe. What had started as a potential threat was now something sacred, something that made hardened men stand still. The old man, Sergeant Henry Miller, sat on the park bench with Rex's head resting on his lap, his wrinkled hand moving gently through the dog's fur. His voice was frail but steady as he began to speak, not to anyone in particular, but to the wind, to the moment, to the memories that still lingered. "They said he didn't make it," Miller murmured. "After the second blast, they pulled me out half dead. They told me the unit's K9 was gone. I begged them to look again, but the desert swallowed everything." His eyes glazed over as if he were back there staring into the smoke. "I tried to move on, but I couldn't. Every time I heard barking, every time I saw a shepherd, I thought of him." Mark knelt beside him, listening intently. The man's tone wasn't that of a storyteller. It was of someone reliving each heartbeat of loss. "Sir," Mark said softly, "he was found later. They said he was injured but alive. They renamed him Rex and brought him into the K9 unit. He's been serving ever since." Miller's lips trembled into a smile. "Of course he was. He always had a will stronger than anyone I knew." He turned his eyes back to the dog. "You never stopped serving, did you, boy?" Rex wagged his tail slowly, pressing closer. As if understanding every word, one of the younger officers, who'd been recording the encounter for protocol, lowered his phone, his expression shifting from duty to emotion. "Sir, are you saying this is your war dog?" Miller nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "Yes, my partner. My best friend. We fought side by side. I lost brothers in that war, but losing him, that was the one wound that never healed." He took a shaky breath, his voice breaking. "And now, after all these years, he finds me again." Mark swallowed hard. He'd spent years training Rex, thinking of him as his partner. But in that instant, he realized the truth. He'd been holding a piece of another man's soul. The park was silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavy. Even the children who had been playing nearby stood still, watching. Miller leaned down, pressing his forehead against Rex's. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. "You always did." And in that single, quiet moment, every officer understood they weren't witnessing a coincidence. They were witnessing a miracle. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind rustled softly through the trees, carrying the faint sounds of the city in the distance. But inside that park, it was as if the world had stopped. The officers stood in a half-circle around the old man and his loyal K9, their faces softened, their postures lowered in respect. The tension, the shouts, the drawn weapons, all of it seemed a distant memory now. Mark Dawson exhaled slowly, feeling his pulse finally steady. He looked at Rex, no Buddy, and for the first time truly saw him. The dog who had disobeyed his command hadn't done it out of rebellion. He had done it out of love, out of recognition. Mark's throat tightened as he realized what that meant. "You weren't breaking orders," he whispered under his breath. "You were finding home." One of the younger officers wiped at his eyes, pretending it was just dust. Another removed his cap, lowering it against his chest. "I've seen dogs follow commands," he said quietly, "but I've never seen one follow his heart." The words struck everyone deeply. Miller sat still, his hand resting gently on Buddy's head. "You trained him well," he said to Mark, his voice trembling with gratitude. "You gave him purpose when he lost everything." Mark shook his head. "No, sir," he replied softly.
"He gave me purpose."
"I just didn't realize it until now." Rex, or Buddy, looked up between them, his eyes bright with warmth as if he understood the exchange. His tail wagged faintly, brushing against the bench leg. The dog had served 2 masters, 2 lifetimes, 2 wars, one of combat and one of survival. And now, for the first time, both men stood side by side, connected by him. A small crowd had formed nearby, their phones lowered now, tears visible in more than one pair of eyes. They weren't watching a police operation anymore. They were witnessing something far greater, a reunion that defied logic, time, and loss. Mark turned to his team. "Stand down," he said gently. "This isn't a suspect. This is a soldier's reunion." His voice cracked slightly at the last word. The officers nodded silently. The park grew quiet again. The setting sun painted everything in gold. The trees, the old man's weathered face, and the loyal K9 resting beside him. It wasn't just a reunion anymore. It was a lesson in faith, loyalty, and the bond that even death had failed to break. And for every officer who witnessed it that day, something changed forever. They left believing not just in duty, but in destiny. Word of the extraordinary reunion spread faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, the story had made headlines across every local news channel. War hero reunites with long-lost K9 after a decade apart. Photographs of the moment, an old man in tears, a loyal German shepherd pressed against him, circulated online, touching hearts across the world. Messages poured in from veterans, soldiers, and families who understood what such a bond meant. At the police station, Mark watched the footage replay on a small TV in the break room. Every time the camera zoomed in on Rex's soulful eyes, he felt his chest tighten. The department phones rang non-stop. Reporters, journalists, even military officials calling to confirm the story. For once, the entire force wasn't dealing with crime or chaos. They were part of something pure, something human. Later that week, a black SUV pulled up outside the precinct. 2 high-ranking officers from the U.S. Army stepped out, their uniforms crisp, their expressions solemn. One carried a folder, the other a small wooden box draped in a flag. They greeted Mark with firm handshakes before asking to see Sergeant Henry Miller and the K9 known as Rex. When Miller entered, supported by his cane, the room fell silent. He wore his old medals pinned to his jacket, each one glinting faintly in the light. Rex trotted beside him, his tail wagging proudly. The senior officer stepped forward. "Sergeant Miller," he said respectfully, "we owe you an apology. It seems the Army made a mistake years ago. Your K9 partner wasn't lost in the blast. He was found, rehabilitated, and continued to serve with distinction." Miller smiled faintly, his eyes brimming. "He's always been a fighter," he whispered. Resting a hand on Rex's head, the officer opened the box, revealing a gleaming medal and a new tag engraved with both names. Sergeant Henry Miller and K9 Buddy, Rex, reunited in service and spirit. "On behalf of the military," the officer continued, "we honor your bravery and the unbreakable bond between you and your dog. You both served this nation together." Applause filled the room. Mark stood near the back, clapping quietly, a proud smile on his face. For Rex, it wasn't about medals or cameras. It was about finally being beside the man he'd waited years to find. As Miller accepted the medal, he looked at Mark. "Thank you for taking care of him," he said softly. "He never stopped being a soldier." Mark's eyes glistened. "And he never stopped being yours." In that moment, everyone understood this wasn't just recognition from the military. It was redemption from fate itself. Months passed after the reunion, and the bond between Henry Miller and Rex grew stronger than ever. The two were inseparable, walking together every morning, sitting by the park bench every afternoon, and visiting the police station once a week, where Rex was treated like a legend. Officers would smile when they saw the old man's wrinkled hand resting on Rex's back, the two moving in perfect rhythm. For Miller, those months felt like a second life, a borrowed miracle. For Rex, it felt like coming home. But time, unkind as it is, never pauses. Miller's health began to decline quietly, the toll of age and war finally catching up. His steps grew slower, his breath shorter, and some mornings he couldn't rise from bed. Yet Rex never left his side. When Miller coughed in the night, the dog would nudge his arm as if asking if he was okay. When he dozed off, Rex would lie across his feet like a guardian of dreams. One quiet evening, Mark visited their home. The small house smelled of coffee and old books, the kind of place filled with stories that could never be told enough. Miller sat in his armchair, a blanket over his legs, while Rex rested beside him. The old man looked up and smiled faintly. "He still wakes me before sunrise," he said softly. "Guess some habits never die," Mark chuckled. "He still thinks he's on duty." Miller nodded, his hand brushing through Rex's fur. "He always was, even when the world forgot us." His voice wavered slightly. "But I'm at peace now. He found me. That's all I ever prayed for." A week later, on a cold Sunday morning, the world grew a little quieter. Miller didn't wake up. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, a faint smile on his face, and Rex lying beside him, his head resting on the old man's chest. When Mark arrived, the sight made his knees weak. The loyal K9 didn't move when the medics entered. He stayed still, guarding the man who had once guarded him. The funeral was held with full honors. Soldiers, police officers, and townspeople gathered to pay respect to a man and his dog who had defied time itself. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Rex whimpered softly, refusing to leave. Mark knelt beside him, tears welling. "He's resting now, buddy," he whispered. But Rex only pressed his nose against the wooden surface, as if trying to understand where his master had gone. That night, back at the station, Rex lay quietly in his corner. His eyes were open, but his spirit seemed elsewhere. The next morning, Mark found him lying peacefully, his head resting on Miller's folded uniform. He was gone, reunited once more with his master, not in this world but beyond it. And though the world mourned, there was comfort in knowing one truth. Loyalty, like Rex's, doesn't die. It simply follows the one it loves home. Weeks passed since that quiet morning when the world lost two heroes. The town that had once watched their reunion now mourned their goodbye. At the police department, Rex's empty kennel remained untouched, his vest neatly folded, his leash hung on the wall like a relic of loyalty. Officers passed by it silently, each remembering the dog who had taught them what devotion truly meant. Mark often found himself stopping there, his hand brushing over the nameplate that still read Rex K9 Unit. He couldn't bring himself to change it. To him, Rex wasn't gone, he was eternal. The story of Sergeant Henry Miller and his dog spread far beyond their small city. News channels, veterans groups, and animal organizations shared their journey. The soldier who never gave up hope and the dog who crossed time to find him again. Letters poured in from all over the world. Children sent drawings of a soldier and a German shepherd under a flag. Old veterans wrote, "They remind us what brotherhood really means." Even strangers who'd never known them said the story had changed how they saw loyalty. A month later, the town held a memorial ceremony in the same park where their reunion had taken place. The fountain glistened in the afternoon sun, and the air carried a sense of reverence. At the center stood a bronze statue, a soldier kneeling beside his K9 partner, their eyes locked forever in unspoken trust. On the plaque beneath it were the words, "In memory of Sergeant Henry Miller and K9 buddy Rex." A bond unbroken by war, time, or death. As the crowd gathered, Mark stepped forward to lay a small wreath of flowers at the base. He stood for a long moment, lost in silence. "You taught us more than obedience," he whispered. "You taught us love." A gentle breeze swept across the park, rustling the leaves. For a fleeting second, Mark swore he heard the faint echo of barking in the distance, soft, joyful, and free. From that day on, the statue became a place of pilgrimage. Veterans saluted when they passed. Children left dog treats and flags. Officers brought new recruits there to teach them that service wasn't just about duty, it was about heart. Years later, when Mark looked back on his career, no medal or commendation compared to the lesson he learned from that one extraordinary dog. He often told rookies, Rex didn't just protect lives, he reminded us what it means to live with purpose. And as the sun dipped behind the statue each evening, it cast two shadows side by side, man and dog, partners still. A legacy carved not in stone, but in every heart that still believed in the power of loyalty, courage, and love that never ends.